Good morning and welcome to our final plenary of the meeting. As Dean said, I'm Bud Harrell from Fordham University Grad School of Religion and Religious Education in New York City. Our panelists are all folks that most of you know well, so the introductions will be brief. We'll start with Claire Smith, Director of Youth Theology and Youth Ministry Specialist in Residence at St. Paul School of Theology in Kansas City. Welcome, Claire. Thank you for being here. Next we have, at the end, Roger Nishioka. Roger holds the Benton Family Chair in Christian Education at Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia. Then in the middle here we have Kathy Winnings, Professor of Religious Education and Ministry at the Unification Theological Seminary in the greater New York City area. And then last but not least, we have David Hogue, Professor of Pastoral Theology and Counseling at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary in Evanston, Indiana. Illinois, sorry. Illinois. I don't know about you, but I've really enjoyed having David with us at the conference this year. And I thought that perhaps we should invite him back next year. And I thought the perfect assignment would be if he could get that God helmet. And we could try it on and he could interpret what's going on for us. Anyway, our panelists were given a special assignment for the conference. Specifically, they were asked to serve as embedded listeners. They were asked to participate in the annual conference and to listen to the presentations and conversations with the following questions in mind. 1, what are the implications of what I am hearing for the field of religious education? And 2, how did the presentations and conversations address the racially, ethnically, and religiously diverse constituencies and interests of the REA? So with those two questions in mind, each of our embedded listeners will be invited to offer about 10 to 12 minutes of comments, with the REA members going first and then David with his comments last. We'll then open up the forum for conversation, beginning with perhaps comments or questions the embedded listeners have for one another, and then inviting all of you to join in the conversation as time permits. So welcome to our final plenary again, and our first commenter will be Claire Smith.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I'm grateful for the opportunity, the privilege of responding. This has been an excellent conference and I've enjoyed it immensely. I've rolled the two questions together, and in some cases, instead of maybe saying for the field, I've said for REA, because REA can be a model for the field, if that makes sense. First, awareness. I found in this conference an awareness of issues of diversity and a desire to include all. And the assignment said racially, ethnically, and religiously diverse constituencies, but I saw some other pieces of diversity coming in terms of awareness of creation and gender. And it came up at different times, particularly I think in conversations and responses. If something was left out, someone in a question or comment might make sure it came to the table. Some examples, specific examples, there was more, in presentations there was more than one reference to the research with both Roman Catholic nuns and Buddhist monks. There was a reference to what happened to Native peoples, a very underrepresented group. And one comment that struck me in the opening was the brain uses different structures in reaching kin, and what it means for us, and the gospel that tells us about reaching out and loving neighbor, and neighbor being more than kin. And then at the women's luncheon, a question was asked that kind of opened up for other possibilities that did not come out, in the presentation. So there's generally an awareness. There are two cautions that I'd like to offer. One has to do with something that was said on the first day of the meeting. Both David and then Dean emphasized it some more. And that has to do with brain research being that there are new findings emerging as technology improves, and so findings are being refined as we go along, and sometimes new findings supersede older ones. And in many ways, what we have is provisional. Therefore, we need to be cautious in our approach and not treat it as the gospel, even as we make our interpretations and applications. So I think that's important, that we don't take a naive adaptation to brain research. And while we affirm that brain matters and it has implications for the field, we're cautionary in how we use it. And even as we share with others, we help them to understand too that this is, not sealed in cement. Even as we would deplore people kind of doing this type of thing with a biblical text and interpretation, I think with brain research we need to do that too. But even then, given that there are some things that that come out of this that I think are important for our work in the area of religious education. And one, given the two critical times of tremendous activity, I'm thinking now of infancy to 3-4 years old, and the teenage years. And in the early years, there's what's called the experience-dependent development, where certain things need to happen at certain times for the brain to be wired in particular ways that will not happen later on. There is that has come up fairly consistently over the years. And then given the neuroplasticity of the brain, as we were reminded, the use it or lose it principle and what happens in the teenage years with the pruning. And then thinking of what was said yesterday morning with the amount of time that children spend in homes, and even the influence of the family and parents on choices, and this comes out too in in research on teens, the influence of the parents on worldview and choice. How can we do more so that congregations, faith communities are empowered to educate and support parents in the earliest years of life to nurture and practice? How can we educate and support parents to both nurture and to practice empathy with young children? How do we pay attention to parents in the work we do? How do we promote or encourage scholarship to equip parents for faith formation in the home in ways that are culturally and religiously sensitive? It seems to me when I look around that there isn't really much emphasis on empowering parents and equipping parents for the work that needs to happen in the home, because they're in church for a very short period of time, and what happens in the home is vital, but I don't think parents have an awareness that they need to do this, or that that's part of their role. The second caution has to do with the question, what is normative and what is normal? And how and to what extent does what is considered the normal standard in research take into account race, ethnicity, and religious differences? What are the assumptions in terms of the starting point for brain research? What is luxury and what is normal? And at what point do we hold up the luxury as normal? And an example would be breastfeeding. That's maybe okay for some people and they can do it, but for some others, because of circumstances, it's a luxury. But then it can be held up as normal, and then you know what comes with that. And then do we all process information the same way, regardless of race, ethnicity, and religion? It may be we do, but do we really? And then who gets left out of the conversation and who's remembered? And I'm thinking now particularly of presentations, and to some extent what happens in the research interest groups, the colloquies, the workshops, but more particularly presentations. And I was kind of reflecting and kind of mulling over some of the presentations and thinking about what David said about the centrality of memory to who we are. And what does it mean then to someone or a group of people to be present in a community but not remembered except in passing? What does it mean to a community to not remember that a group of people is present, or to remember that their experiences are different in order to make space for those experiences? Who loses, and how are we all impoverished? If for whatever reason we are unable to have key presenters who represent a less normative in quotations, or dominant worldview, what mechanisms can we have for the stories and the questions that address the racially, ethnically, and religiously diverse constituencies and interests of the REA? Because sometimes we will have presenters who may not have the sensitivity. So then what do we do to ensure that it is there at the table? This is an ongoing work because we come from different spaces, and some of those spaces are monolithic. That's just the reality of who we are and where we come from. But for REA to be true to its interests and to be a model in the field of religious education, it needs to constantly, consistently, and consciously, as part of its explicit curriculum at annual meetings, make room for the questions, the conversations, and the stories. And to do less would be a dim reflection of living under the reign of God. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. I love your two questions that keep us aware of the provisional nature, and then raising the question, what is normal? Maybe who gets to define what is normal? Raises the whole issue of power discourse in the conversation, which is something we haven't raised yet this time. Our next presenter is Roger Nishioka. Go ahead, Roger.
So, thank you, Claire. Nice opening. So I'll start with a story. So I was born and raised in Honolulu, Hawaii. And like the President of the United States, I have a birth certificate and it's real. When I was 11 years old, out of God's great sense of humor, God called my father, who at the time was a United Church of Christ pastor. So this is evidence you can be a pastor's kid and still love Jesus, which is a relief for some, a dilemma to others. And God called my father to pastorate a Presbyterian church, the Japanese Presbyterian Church in Seattle, Washington. I remember being 11 years old. I was second of three at the time. The fourth one, the mistake, had not yet been born. And that's his name. And so we moved to Seattle. And I remember being there the third day or so, 11 years old. And we were in McDonald's. And Garfield, the third one, the youngest, had not yet developed his inside voice. And he was holding Mom's hand. He was 5 years old in front of myself and my older brother, Jason, who was an air traffic controller back in Honolulu. Never fly to Honolulu. Anyway, Garfield holding Mom's hand, third day in Seattle, we wondered two things. We wondered where the sunshine went. And we wondered what had happened to our view of America, what's normal. Because growing up in Honolulu, this is not unusual. We thought America was 70% Asian Polynesian. So Garfield, in his wonderful way, holding Mom's hand, third day, Dad probably was at church getting his office set up, blurts out in McDonald's, "So, Mom, I just want to know, where did all these white people come from?" "No, look, I'm serious, they're everywhere." So like, who let them in? I thought this was America. And Jason and I, to be honest, we leaned forward because we were intrigued by this question as well. We just didn't have the nerve to ask it yet. And Mom, I remember, was going, shh. No, look, they're everywhere. Look, they're everywhere. So 11 years old, I began to start my schooling at Wilson Middle School, and the Seattle School District was going through desegregation, and the best thinking at the time was to take the minority population and spread us out among majority populations throughout parts of Seattle. And so in our Asian, African American, and Hispanic, Latino, Latina neighborhood, we got bused to all ends of Seattle, mostly into white schools, of course, so we could integrate the city of Seattle school district. My teacher, my first non-Asian Polynesian teacher of my life, Mrs. Plummer, who I loved, was very, very nice. This is in the north end of Seattle, Wilson Middle School, 6th grade. And my parents went, after my being there for a few months, for the usual teacher-parent night. And I remember that they came back, and I said, "How did it go?" And they said it was fine. And Dad said, "Mrs. Plummer doesn't understand you." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because she gave you a low grade in one area, class participation." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "We tried to explain it to her. She said to us, to your mom and to me, Roger's obviously very bright. He seems to know a lot. Whenever I ask a question of the class, he never raises his hand. He sits there." My father said to her, "That's correct. That's his job. You call on him, he'll tell you the right answer, but he will not raise his hand." She said, "Well, that's a problem. Roger needs to raise his hand when I ask a question in the class." And my father said, "No, Roger is a Japanese American. He waits until you, the person in authority, invite him to participate, and then he will give you the right answer." And she said, "No, that's not class participation." It strikes me that all of us in this room who teach, I would wager, on our syllabi, we have something called class participation as qualification for what it means to be a student in our classrooms. It also strikes me, as Dr. Smith has raised beautifully, the question of what is normal and what is normative. And it strikes me with some confessional mode that even as a Japanese American, a 4th generation Asian American teacher, I find myself looking at my own Asian and Asian American students and wondering why they don't raise their hand. And it takes me back to Mrs. Plummer in Seattle, Washington, and 6th grade. And I have to remember who I am and the place from which I come. So given all that we have heard this weekend and all that we now understand about brain structure and our understanding, it should come as no surprise that race, ethnicity, and culture shape not only how we view the world, but also, increasingly, evidence as to how our brains are wired. In a report in a special section on culture and psychology in the July 2010, last July, issue of Perspectives on Psychological Science, a journal of the Association for Psychological Science, 2 scientists, Denise C. Park, Korean American, of the Center for Brain Health at the University of Texas at Dallas, and Chi Mao Wong from the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, discuss ways in which brain structure and function are influenced by culture. They give evidence that the collectivist nature of East Asian cultures, their study among Koreans, Chinese, and Japanese, and Korean Americans, Chinese Americans, and Japanese Americans, versus individualistic Western cultures, affects brain and behavior. They argue that East Asians tend to process information in a globalistic way, whereas Westerners tend to focus on individual objects. There are differences between East Asians and Westerners with respect to attention and categorization and reasoning and participation. For example, in one study, after viewing pictures of fish swimming, Japanese volunteers were more likely to remember contextual details of the whole image than were American volunteers. Experiments tracking participants' eye movements revealed that Westerners spend more time looking at particular objects, focal objects, while Chinese and Korean volunteers look more at the whole background. Says Park, to use a camera analogy, Americans are more zoom, Asians are more panoramic. University professor, Michigan professor Richard Nesbitt wrote further about the difference between Asian and Western thinking in his book that I use in a class that I teach on second generation Asian American ministry. His book is titled The Geography of Thought, Asian and Western Minds at Work, published in 2003. In essence, Nesbitt argues that Western thinkers place the highest value on agency, the idea that each person's goal is to be a competent individual possessing a freedom to act as one chooses. Independence and the ability to assert oneself are valued and most respected. In contrast, Nesbitt says, Asian thinkers place the highest value on harmony, not agency, but harmony, and one's role within a community, believing that each person is primarily a part of a collective and does not have a unique claim or identity, but rather is a piece of an inseparable whole. Further, Nesbitt, and this is why I appreciate his research in particular from my perspective, talks about the precarious nature in his second to the last chapter of the Asian American, who finds himself, herself, torn between both perspectives. If you hear resonance of W.E.B. Du Bois' double consciousness, I'm glad, because we shift our weight between harmony and agency to survive in this culture. While numerous studies suggest that culture may affect neural function, there's an emerging evidence for the effect of cultural experiences on brain structure, a field thus far named cultural neuroscience. The study conducted by Park, in addition to a colleague, Michael Chi from Duke University, which is dubious, of course, because they worship Satan there. But he's redeemed because he also is on faculty at the National University of Singapore, showed evidence for Blue Devils, give me a break, showed evidence for thicker frontal cortex areas involved in reasoning in Westerners compared to East Asians, whereas East Asians had thicker cortexes in the perceptual areas. Again, this broad panoramic view. Whether the cause is genetic or cultural, or certainly more likely a mix of both, people with different brain structures are going to perceive reality differently, and for us, religious claims and practices differently. At the very least, such research calls into question the notion of universal principles, such as agency, upon which our idea thus far of democracy is predicated. There are emerging conversations about what we're doing really in Afghanistan and Iraq as Canadians and as Americans in trying to build democracy there. It seems that one caution, given Claire your fine comments to us to start on what is normal, is to remember that much of brain research is still being done, by and large, in the Western world, and mostly on populations of Western persons. It behooves us, as religious educators, we are the ones who seem to claim that we know best how persons come to know what they know. It behooves us to remember that not all knowing yet is valued, even in this research.
Thank you, Roger, for your comments on cultural neuroscience and the implications for religious education. Your comments certainly deepen and enrich the explorations of this annual meeting. Our third presenter, Kathy Winnings from the New York City area.
Thank you, Bud. I'm going to take a different view, 3 different people, 3 different senses of what we've all experienced this weekend. Over the space of this annual meeting, we were able to delve into the intersection of neuroscience and religious education. The plenaries allowed us to look at different facets of the theme, with David Hogue providing us with a rudimentary comparison between neuroscience and practical theology that also allowed us to consider the theological possibilities of this burgeoning field, followed by Dean's integration of some of the key literature, ultimately asking how we can become at home with our brain as religious educators. To then Mary Gordon's poignant example of her social justice application, if you will, of the topic through outreach to schools and young children with empathy focus, and last night's stimulating description of Barbara Bradley Haggerty's journey through this discipline, ending with some possibilities and some challenges presented by neuroscience. Our discussion was further enriched by the research interest groups, the workshops and colloquia that covered diverse applications, questions, and possibilities presented by this intersection of neuroscience and RE, with discussions on empathy, programming, creativity, the arts, storytelling, reflective and pedagogical practices, spirituality and spiritual formation, worship, women's contributions, adolescence, technology, Islamic education, diverse types of schools, social justice issues, and imagination, to overgeneralize what we all discussed. What are the implications of these conversations for our field, in my mind? First, for me, is the old adage that the more you know, the more you realize what you don't know. Our conversations this weekend have allowed many of us, myself included, to step away from our theological and academic comfort zones and our normal language to look at and delve into the intersection of theology and science. For years, theologians and faith-based individuals were often at odds with empirical science and knowledge, often feeling marginalized, or even, if you will, like stepchildren. But now we're at the place where we're being invited to join the conversation as a dialogue partner with neuroscience. And well, we should, because as we've seen this weekend, the questions and issues that are being raised are not so much scientific questions and issues as they are religious, theological, moral questions. This is certainly a field that we as religious educators should not shy away from, because these are not only theological issues to be discussed and reflected on, but they're also themes and concepts that are central to the courses that you and I teach every day, and that are central to the ongoing spiritual life of our students and our faith communities. For if we shy away from engaging this field and its concepts, that may be construed as acquiescing to some of neuroscience's conclusions at best, or giving tacit agreement of their findings, or legitimizing them at worst. More importantly, I believe that dialogue with neuroscience will not only be exciting and stimulating for us, but will benefit our field. I see this in terms of the possibilities it offers pedagogically. For the courses I teach, I've included brain-based learning concepts, and it's been extremely stimulating for our students and our faculty. And also in terms of the insights that we might gain toward greater self-understanding, as well as the challenge and encouragement to ask penetrating and valuable questions that will shape and impact our spiritual life. However, we also need to learn from past experiences with other innovative ideas and not fall into the same pitfalls. And I'm reminded of what happened when human development theories were in vogue. Many educators, religious and otherwise, latched onto these theories and allowed them to determine or prescribe what they saw or expected to see from their students. We cannot do the same with the findings for the field of neuroscience. As also mentioned by Claire earlier, we have to be critical of it and learn how to see these concepts as informing what we do, and that may at times contribute to our ever-deepening understanding of ourselves, but they can never prescribe or determine what we do and think. These theories will not be a panacea for everything that we see as needing to be changed. So we need to be critically engaged with neuroscience. And this is important not only for us as religious educators and people of faith, but I think it's equally important for the field of neuroscience itself. Finally, how did our conversation with neuroscience address our diverse interests and constituencies here in REA? In this regard, I'm left with more questions than answers. And this is a good thing. I like living with the question. I tell my students, don't come here looking for answers necessarily here at the seminary, but try to leave with questions, because that's part of our quest in seeking God and our relationship with God, in my opinion. So this is a perfect time to raise these questions. Questions such as, how can neuroscience help shed light on understanding and resolving vital social justice concerns? We may have scratched the surface with Mary Gordon, but not nearly enough. I wanted to hear more conversation. I want to hear more conversation and engagement. What does this mean for our social justice issues of inequality, discrimination, abuse, violence? Is it possible that neuroscience will be able to help us recognize why we continue to make the decisions that violate the other, whoever that other may be? Will neuroscience be able to enrich the dialogue between men and women, between diverse cultures, ethnicities, or generations, so that we might see each other in ways that reflect the best of our religious traditions? And what possibilities will neuroscience offer in relationship to the dynamics between us as men and women of diverse faith traditions, practices, and beliefs? I wanted to hear more in that. I'd like to hear a richer interfaith discussion with this. The one conclusion that I've reached through my own conversation and dialogue with the field and through this weekend is that God gave us a very powerful and I think amazing organ, our brain. And we're just beginning to look at it. My own journey started with a near-death experience with God and with Jesus. When I thought my car was going to go off the mountain outside of Durango, Colorado, my life flashed before me. And then after our car ended up miraculously back on the road, I had an experience in which God said, I have given you rebirth and new life. And that started me on my quest with God. So neuroscience to me is, I think, an amazing discovery, because that has shown me the power of God. Because we can't create a human brain. We may like to think we can, and we may try, but this is something that is a mystery for us. And I think our task is to enjoy this journey of discovering aspects of that mystery with God and with each other. So I look forward to that journey and that conversation. And in that regard, following our Star Trek analogy, begun by Dean and by Winning, and if you may, maybe science is not the final frontier. Maybe the human brain is the final frontier. Who knows?
Thank you very much, Kathy. I see in your remarks a sort of a double invitation. The first invitation to engage in dialogue with neuroscience and see what we can distinctively bring as educators and religious educators to the kinds of questions that are coming to the fore about spirituality, morality, and personhood. And secondly, the invitation to raise and address all those questions non-anxiously, to know that we don't have to have the answers, but that the real learning is in asking the questions. So thank you. Our last presenters, David Hoke here, before we open up for conversations.
Thank you, and thanks to all of you as well. Bud had suggested a slightly different agenda for my response. Since I'm not a member of REA and don't share your history and the memories that you have of each other over years and even decades, but to be, if you will, a kind of a participant observer, an outsider was actually the language that he used, and to offer perceptions from that vantage point. I'm listening to my colleagues to the right, though, a couple of things that I had intended to say anyway, is I haven't felt like nearly as much of an outsider as I would have expected. For several reasons my best friends are religious educators. I know I've known a number of you here and in other settings, and I have felt really quite at home, and was commenting last night about the hospitality I had felt. Last night at dinner, Roger offered to remedy the hospitality I had felt, but I felt that was important to feel as at home here as I could.
You're a Presbyterian.
Yeah, that's right. But it has been just a delightful and important experience for me to be here from several standpoints. I've been working in this area for a fairly long time now, and at times have felt very alone in that venture. Being here and getting to share with you and hearing from you the ways many of you are already deeply engaged in this work has been reassuring to me, not only at a conscious level, but has, I think, also contributed to my feeling at home here. I want to thank Dean and the others of you who have taken leadership in that. The conversations have been really quite rich. And the format of my not kind of dropping in, saying something, engaging a few questions and leaving, but getting to stay and be here for extended conversations has been really rich. I was going to say that for me, one of the real highlights, this whole thing had built up to Barbara's presentation, which I just found, even though I'd read the book, I knew a lot of the material she was presenting was a real highlight for me, but I realized listening to the three people to my right has just upped the ante on that because of the thoughtfulness here. I have demonstrated the level of conversation here. I'm not surprised that religious educators do that. I'm comparing it to other groups that I've been engaged with and have just really appreciated the depth, both theoretical and practical, that have been raised. And one of my reflections after being with you for a few days is this unfortunate and misguided theory-praxis divide seems to be significantly diminished here. Most, if not all of you, are both practitioners and theoreticians, and those seem, in most cases, seamlessly blended, and that's noticeable to an outsider who comes. I have recognized the very close, some of my colleagues and I have talked about why are pastoral theology and religious education different fields, because we deal with a lot of the same issues, similar materials, similar theoreticians here, and I have detected a slightly different ethos, but the overlap is what's more remarkable to me in that way. I have enjoyed watching the ways you go about remembering who you are. The stories that you tell, and hearing the chances to share the stories of those who have passed on, even last night at the banquet. I fit within that storytelling and remembering kind of piece that seems really, really critical. I'm struck by the interfaith and international commitments that you not only talk about but embody. And it's been terrific here to be engaged with people of several different kinds of faith traditions that are here. There are some things I wish we had gotten to, and my colleagues have just started to put their finger on them. It's, as Kathy was pointing out, the more we talk, the more we realize there is to talk about. So I don't feel necessarily guilty about this or neglectful on any of our accounts in this regard. But in some conversations, it's dawned on me that the developmental issues around neurology and neural development are really, really critical. There's a very large literature, not only on those peaks in early infancy, around brain development, and then late adolescence, early young adulthood, but the aging brain, the generativity brain. There is an amazing literature that I remember when I was first studying this, the professor started outlining the ways brain development lined up with Piaget's developmental sequence, for instance. And I think that's a whole conversation that could be really quite interesting. Roger, thanks for raising the cultural piece. I only alluded to that in the beginning. We were trying to set a stage for a conversation, but that is a fascinating and intriguing. And I have a colleague at Northwestern, a Chinese neuroscientist, who's doing work around religion, culture, and the brain as well. And those studies really need to progress, as so many sciences have been. And gender issues. It has struck me that the neurosciences, like many sciences, backed off of even looking at those because of the dangerous ways sciences have been used historically around race, around class, and around gender. And I think we still have to be very, very cautious when we begin talking about neurological differences, because there is still that intersection of both the genetic code and the environment that are going on. And it's very difficult still in the early stages of this science to assign causal explanations to anything. But once we start saying women's brains are different from men's brains, we can fall, I think, into many pitfalls are possible there, like saying women can't be scientists. That mistake was made publicly a number of years ago and fortunately got called out. So I think we have to be very careful, recognizing that, one, those differences are usually broad generalizations about populations, and many men and women, like many people across racial identities, share more in common than are different. And so I think we do need to do that kind of science, but we need to be very, very cautious in how we do it. You would have gathered that I've had great interest in empathy. It relates to both of our disciplines here, and I think the neuroscience around that has been just fascinating, and it was good to hear Mary Gordon's experience of that yesterday. I think there's a lot more work, like Kathy too, a lot more work to be done there, because the ability to understand what someone else is experiencing or might be thinking is in some ways a neutral capacity. If we don't have it, it's difficult to relate, but we can use it for malicious as well as pro-social kinds of ends. Some of my colleagues point out that it's likely those who engage in certain forms of violence and even torture may be highly empathic in the sense that they can understand what's going to be most painful, what's going to be most difficult. So we need to think through, I think, more fully and more theologically and more ethically what we really mean by empathy and what it means to nurture empathy. One more, just a couple more comments, and then I will stop. This notion of empathy cross-culturally. I just, again, briefly alluded to a dearth of research in that, but David Augsburger at Fuller Seminary used to refer to that as interpathy, this intercultural empathy. I think that's another area not only of cultural difference, but what does it require of the brain, since apparently the brain uses different neural structures to relate to persons of other cultures. What does that mean? How can we think about that and use that in our religious education, in our pastoral formation, in ways that might help us not only understand what the constraints are, but what are the possibilities for us in nurturing those kinds of social justice and global kinds of issues that really face us in that way. Just in passing, I used a Charlie Brown cartoon in my presentation on Friday, and another one just occurred to me, and hearing the ways you all are working with this material, and I wish I had it so I could actually quote it or show it even. But I remember a cartoon where Charlie Brown and Lucy, and I'm suspecting it was Schroeder, were lying on a grassy hillside looking up at the clouds. And they're imagining what they see in the clouds when they look at that formation. Some of you remember this cartoon, I can tell that. And Lucy says, well, I see Da Vinci's The Last Supper. And you can see John leaning on Jesus' breast, and you can see Judas Iscariot kind of off to the right. It goes into great detail about what she sees, how she sees that mural in the clouds. And Schroeder says, that's interesting. I see a map of South America, and you can see Venezuela, and you can see Uruguay, and you can see different. It starts pointing this out. And I'm feeling a little bit more like Charlie Brown. They turned to him and said, Charlie Brown, what do you see? And Charlie Brown said, well, I was going to say I see a ducky and a horsey, but I think I've changed my mind. Just hearing the ways different people are putting this together when we get into this tendency to oversimplify what we see. So I want to just thank you all for this chance to hear how you're thinking about these things and working with this as well. And I really hope your conversations will continue about this. I think it's important. It's not the final word, but it's one voice that I think we can to all of our benefits, pay attention to. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, David, for your affirming comments of our work, for your comments on the overlapped and yet distinctive approaches of our two disciplines, as well as your cautioning comments about being aware of the need to explore differences in how brain development is affected by age, gender, and culture, and yet being careful about making overly broad generalizations. So thank you very much. I'd like to open it up at this point for broader conversation. Could we begin with just the panel? Is there any comments the panelists would want to direct at one another? Or we open up to the broader? No. All right. Well, how about among those present? We have a bit of time yet. Comments, questions on panel conversation in general, or directed to any one of the particular panelists?
Can I do one first?
What?
Kathy, I was struck by a phrase that you used, that we are being invited by neuroscientists into conversations. So I want to turn to David, because you've had many more conversations with neuroscientists than I have. Is that your experience? Are neuroscientists, I know this is a generalization, sorry, but in your experience, are they aware of our investment in the discourse as well, and are they eager for these kinds of conversations? Are these kinds of conversations taking place among them in their conferences as well, where education, where pastoral theology, where theology in general, human development, etc.?
It's really an excellent question, and I think I think I tried to say something about this on Friday, but let me see if I can say a little bit more. In general, I'm not convinced that they need us like we want the information that they have.
That's my impression.
That's not their primary concern. I think there are two things that are going on, though, that counter that a little bit, and I will say a little bit. And as is true, I think, in many of the sciences, there is an increasing concern with how that information, when it gets out into the public, is being used. And so there is some conversation that I've been overhearing about how are people making use of this? Are we communicating it as scientists in ways that mean it's being used in accountable, responsible ways? Rather than with so many scientific findings that then, well, like the split brain theory, just got, people kind of ran with that in ways that went well beyond. So there's that that's going on. But there are some scientists who actually are, as Kathy says, coming to some of us, to a number of us, and saying, we need your help. This woman I mentioned at Northwestern, the colleague, the neuroscientist, said, we're trying to do this work around culture and religion, but we know that religion is a very complicated kind of phenomenon, and we need help in really kind of operationalizing that. What are we really looking at here beyond that? Andy Newberg is frequently seeking help of professionals in religion. and scholars because they've tended to collapse much of religious experience into mystical experience and make that the paradigmatic kind of religious experience, and then making what are probably too broad a generalizations without distinguishing that from other whatever non-religious experience is, not making those kinds of sharp distinctions. A number of years ago, there was a conference, the American Association for the Advancement of Science has for years had a program called the Dialogue on Science and Religion. And they now have a part-time director who is an astrophysicist who works on the Hubble telescope, but who is really working with religious communities and theological educational institutions to see how that is taking place. And they sponsored a conference at MIT a number of years ago that I participated in on Our Brains Ourselves, where included lowly people like me and Steven Pinker on these panels to talk about the issues at stake. So there are some windows where important things, the Vatican has been doing important work that's brought together scientists and theologians. So I think there are really some hopeful signs about that dialogue.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have 2 mics if people would want to come up and offer their questions.
I just wanted to mention a conference I was at 2 weekends ago at the University of Western Ontario, sponsored by the Harris Woodman Chair in Psychiatry. It was international, and it brought together neurobiologists, psychiatrists, and people in the helping field. And the thing that was key was that most of them had also an interest in Jungian psychology. But the theme of the conference was the brain, trauma, and the helping relationship. And it was the kind of place where I believe that we should be communicating with. The participants were mostly medical doctors, but also social workers, caseworkers, etc. But, they had speakers from England, all over, and it happened in Canada. The invisible minority here. So I think there is a lot going on out there, and I was most impressed by the quality, how shall I say, of the care that these people had for, and the respect for the individual. And, whether they were religious or not, they could be, we would be one with them. So I think there's exciting work being done.
Thank you.
I was wondering about Howard Gardner's multiple intelligence theory, the different ways people learn, and whether that whole theory had a whole brain-based learning theory behind it. But in looking at that, how we learn differently in the multiple sensory faculties that we have, how much of the brain does that really cover? Is it really spread out all over the brain, or do his 5 theories, are they really localized in a particular part of the brain? People learn visually, auditorily, movement, touch, and so on. How much is his theory spread out around the brain, or is it pretty much localized? I don't know, David, whether you would be able to handle that, or...
Oh, I don't know, Kathy, you've done some work with that.
Yeah, let me speak to that for just a second. Actually, there was 2 books produced through the gathering of an international gathering of neuroscientists that basically decided what was currently acceptable neuroscience theory, what was speculative but might be true, what was speculative but really speculative, and then things they called neuromyths. And the author is Tracy Takahuma Espinoza, and she is part of the Mind Brain Education Group. Was even thinking about trying to bring her here, but she teaches in Quito, Ecuador, which would have made the trip prohibitive for the association. But she has excellent work. She notes that Gardner's theories are not included in what they call neuroeducation. And Gardner himself acknowledges that. So interestingly enough, right now, though he's a robust conversation partner and actually will be addressing a neuroscience and education group in Boston in I think about 3 weeks, his theories are still not incorporated in as what they've acknowledged as having neural correlates to match that theory. The only reason I say that is there is work being done in neuroscience and education that's very careful, and there's a lot of material there we can draw from that could help us, I think, from that standpoint.
If I could add to that, Chuck, if you look at some of the material from Eric Jensen and Davis Souza, because they do it from the pedagogical aspect, they hint at this and they talk about that as, you know, justification for understanding. But as Dean was saying, they haven't really gone out on a limb to say anything definitive. But you can find the threads, at least in some of their writings, for sure.
David, do you want to add to that at all?
My colleagues know more about that particular question than I do. Well, just more generally, in a kind of a theological frame, Don Browning, now of blessed memory, asked me a question a couple of years ago at a conference, whether or not I thought, as he did, that much of what the neurosciences are finding is tending to confirm things we've known for millennia. Maybe challenging some, but by and large, just providing a kind of another level of explanation for things we already know, that I wouldn't be surprised if what we find coming from the sciences eventually tends to document. But in this society, it carries incredible weight of credibility. So again, I think we have to be a little careful about how we use all of those kind of correlations.
Wonderful. You want to come up to the mic?
Thank you. Tom Groom, Boston College. This is fascinating, and it's an amazing, for me at least, an amazing new literature, a new language that I don't know what I'm going to do to catch up. Up to this time, a hippocampus was obviously a hippo who went to college, and now I can't even remember what the hippocampus is supposed to do, but which says something about my hippocampus. My question follows on from the previous one. I'm wondering, because in our field, the developmental paradigm has really become somewhat canonical, you know, beginning with Piaget, and then Kohlberg, Gilligan, and Fowler, and Parks, and so on, so that we've come to, in a sense, to just assume upon the developmental paradigm and the developmental psychology. I'm wondering, and especially to David, if neuroscience confirms that or challenges that, or do they, when they talk to each other, what happens, or do they talk to each other at all? Because in a sense, when you think of somebody moving from stage 4 to stage 5 or stage 6 and embracing paradox and all kinds of things, you wonder what's going on in the brain. Is it that the brain has developed, or are we just asking better questions, or what's the correlation between those two fields of research?
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating question, and I had a conversation with Bob yesterday where we were teasing out a little bit of that, and I come away from a meeting like this going back with about 10 new literatures I want to dig into, and that you've put your finger on one of them. I do remember I think it was that very first neuropsych course I had back in the mid-'80s, where the professor was actually lining up Piaget against what was then known developmentally in neuroscience, and they were finding pretty clear kind of correlations in terms of ages at which capacities, both cognitive and affective, that we would expect based on the theories that we have, they were finding notable brain changes that were matching those pretty closely. There's now a whole area called developmental neurobiology. And I don't know it well enough to answer your question with any high level of confidence, but the scholar I have enjoyed reading, well, enjoyed is wrong because he's so dense it's encyclopedic and takes a great deal of effort to work through it, but he's Alan Shore, Schore, out at UCLA, clinical psychologist who also works in developmental neurobiology. And he really talks about the self developing within those interpersonal relationships and tracks it to particular brain development in childhood and infancy. There is now an increasing study of the aging brain that's going on. So I think that's just a burgeoning field right now. And what the level of conversation is between them, I don't know. But if I can get back to you, in the next few months, I'm now intrigued by that, having spent this time with all of you. Some of the rest of you may have much more information about that than I do.
Anybody else want to comment on that? No? Okay. Thank you for the question, Tom. Come on.
Good morning. Matt Geiger from St. Stephen's and St. Agnes School in Alexandria, Virginia. I have a question regarding two things that I've been thinking about here as we've been having this part of the discussion. I'm interested in thinking about the differences between the way that the brain research reaches the publics that we are related to and the ways that we reach our publics that we're related to, and the intersection of this. So my first question is a question of the public space and the ways in which we want to be a part of this discussion, and the ways in which conversations, whether they, so that we're not simply, as all of our caution that in your wisdom you've pointed to, that we don't simply want to take our let everybody else call the shots with what we're doing theologically, but how genuine conversation takes place in the public and what those venues are. And then I'm also interested in your thoughts on what are our resources for our response. Okay, so our theological heritage, our scriptures, so on and so forth. And when we're thinking about in the sort, the old, now out of date paradigm of science and religion being in conflict, but the ways in which we have resources which both confirm and are antagonistic to whatever findings are coming out of brain research. So I'm interested in our public venues of discussion for this, and also the theological and faith resources that we're drawing on to be a part of this.
Well said. Thank you for your question. Any responders here from the panel?
I'm not sure this completely answers you, Matt, but I was struck by something that David said in our task force yesterday about what got him started in this, and he went and took courses in neuropsychology. So after the task force yesterday, I went up to my room and I started going online to Columbia and NYU, who are my neighbors, and they have psychology departments. So I found Columbia has a couple courses coming up in spring term, so I emailed the faculty person and explained who I was and what I'm doing, and I got a response last night when I opened up this morning, and she said, wow, this is the first time I've had a conversation with a theological person, someone at a seminary. This is great. I wish more from Union would come in, because that's our partner at Columbia's the whole consortium there. And she said, I would welcome you coming into the class, and let's see what kind of conversation we might have. So I was intrigued by that kind of foray. It's a singular thing. It's me going out and talking to someone. I've also been I've got some articles coming out in some other venues that are not, theological professional journals, and trying to engage a conversation. I mean, that's the only thing I can do on my simple level in that sense of getting it out there. But I mean, that's certainly one-on-one, and these kind of simple forays are great grassroots kind of efforts, I think, to get a conversation stirred in a community.
I think that my thoughts were very similar to Kathy's, to say, where are the forums? We have to create them. We have to create them first by making personal contacts and having forums for personal conversation, but then we need to find ways to bring those personal conversations into a more public forum, or more public forums, to continue the kinds of discussion. Where are our resources? Well, I think the foundational resource is this conference and our discussions we've had here, and all the resources that we've raised up at this conference.
Added to that, I think continuing with coming out to this conference, it would be to find some people who are interested in continuing this conversation with you. Maybe thinking through what you heard in the groups that you were a part of, and in the informal conversations, and who would be the people you can continue talking with, because there isn't really something you can necessarily plug into directly. On the other side of it, there is the organization Dean alluded to earlier, the Learning and the Brain Society, and that would be a great organization to join. They have resources available and do great conferences twice a year. But from the theological perspective, I think it's finding people coming out to this conference and seeing who's writing. But it's now coming into, there's much more now than when I first got interested a few years ago. There was practically nothing from our end to draw on, but there's more now. But it calls for some searching and some initiative.
Thank you, Claire. The other piece I would say is I'm looking at Jack Seymour and having a mind meld, which is kind of eerie. Anyway, if we're honest with ourselves, the face of this association is not our conferencing. The face of our association is our journal. And it's because of Jack Seymour and others who have a long tradition of fine work. We have one of the best rated journals in terms of the nature of its writing, the depth of its research, et cetera, among academic journals. And so as the chair of Call for Papers Committee, what I would say is it's incumbent, that's going to be the next entry for this association into this whole discourse. So for those of you who made presentations, research interest groups, for you to refine those papers and get them to my committee and Jack Seymour, and for it to appear, the fact that we have a dedicated issue of the journal for each of these events is a wonderful gift and an amazing thing. And it seems to me that's the next opportunity for an extraordinary foray into this whole discourse and conversation.
And I would add that I attended some wonderful colloquium presentations, that people that have colloquium presentations as well, I encourage you to consider refining them and submitting them for publication to the journal as well. We heard one yesterday on neuroscience in youth ministry that was just really extraordinary. Dean, do you want to add to any comments? I know this is an issue that you've thought about, and lots been said, so maybe you don't have anything to add, but if you did, I wanted to give you the opportunity. No.
If I started, I'd go way too long. So
Jack's going to say something.
Thanks for that advertisement. That's important. That's not what I'm thinking about at the moment. The focus of the panel is on diversity, and we've begun to shy away from it. And I'm good. This really probably isn't a question, Roger. I'm just absolutely fascinated by the comment that you made about certain parts of the brain growing for some people and other parts of the brain growing for other people. And boy, one of the things we need to publish, and the website can do this, is bibliography around that. But I keep thinking about something Mualla Selkuk has continued to teach me, which is that the heart of the Quran is this conviction that God has created us with difference so that we can know each other. It's not the synthesis, it's the difference.
Yes, exactly.
And if you look at the rabbinic readings of the Tower of Babel story, the rabbinic readings say that God's anger was not that we tried to be gods, but that we tried to be all alike. And Christians are beginning to read it in that kind of way. So I guess I'm continuing to wrestle with the synthetic conversation we've had is really great, but somehow we need to start enhancing the diversity conversation too. And I really honor David's comment. I know how dangerous it is. But I also know that there are some differences that have been discovered around gender, which are just fascinating differences. And if Mualla's right, that image about the fact of us learning those differences just enriches the character of what God has created rather than the anxieties. So I guess I just want to call us back to the theme of the panel for a moment.
Thank you. Thank you. Does anybody want to comment on that?
Other than thank you, because I was thinking, I didn't realize this is why I was here, so thank you, Jack.
Speaking of diversity, one of the things that I found interesting is in my practice as a religious educator working in a local congregation, some of my conversation partners are people like non-theistic Buddhists. I live in the Bay Area. Neo-pagans and other folks who would not use the term God. And one of the interesting things that I've noticed, sort of a diversity issue in this conference, is a lot of folks using the word God as a sort of shorthand for something that neuroscience is looking at. And I'm just thinking about some of my other conversation partners and how they might feel left out of this. So I'm just wondering if any of you folks had a comment about that.
Well, I'll just say I think you're right. It does get used as a shorthand, and ought not to be. I think one of the dilemmas, and I mentioned yesterday, I'm picking up Ann Tave's book. I've been carrying it around and have come back to this one on religion explained, or no, is that religious experience, and she's really differentiating, or really nuancing what we mean when we talk about religious experience, because this tendency, as we've talked about, to collapse it into mysticism, as some of the neuroscientists are doing. And comparing what Carmelite nuns are experiencing in meditation with what meditating Buddhist monks are doing. And I'm wondering if those are really the same experience. I think maybe that may be diversity, that we need to kind of tease that out and say to Andy Newberg and others who are doing this and talking about how they compare. I heard Andy a few weeks ago tell the story about doing this research with Carmelite nuns, and they interpret the results to them afterwards. And one nun came in and he said, "Here's what your brain was like when it was praying." And she said, "Thank you, Dr. Newberg. I've had a deep conviction that prayer is real, that something's going on in there, and now you've really confirmed that for me." And Andy, in his inimitable way, said, "It's always good to make a nun happy." But then about a week or two later, he got a call from the head of the Philadelphia Atheist Society who said, "Thank you, Dr. Newberg. You've proved that this all takes place in the brain." And he just thought, well, I guess it's okay to make an atheist happy too. But the fact of the matter is, I think you've put your finger on very distinctive work the neuroscientists actually need to do, and we might need to help them, saying, wait a minute, are these really the same?
Here, here.
You're kind of collapsing them, you're saying they're all the same, and there's this attempt to, I think, find a paradigmatic religious experience. I don't think that doesn't fit what I understand about religious experience. So that's just kind of my take on it.
And a new text out on the cognitive science side of it by Justin Barrett and a couple of others out of the Templeton, but he's at Fuller, keeps the conversation in terms of innateness, meaning, and natural theology in a sense. He tries to take it in that direction, I think, which is an attempt to take it away from what you're talking about, David, also. And maybe that may be the area that will contribute to that aspect of the conversation. You know, I'm just now reading Justin's book. It's a little challenging to get through, but he does provide that conversation and reminder. So that's a good point.
I appreciate too, thank you. I'm back at Matt's earlier question too, and conversation point. So my research field primarily is youth and young adult ministry, and in youth ministry I'm thinking about, yes, the nature of reducing religious experience to these mystical experiences and the equating of Buddhist monks and Carmelite nuns. You know, for years, the model for young people for conversion was to hear this dramatic testimony from a person who was doing all kinds of really fun behaviors and then found Jesus and then changed, and which is a burden. And Fellowship of Christian Athletes and a whole series of other organizations, all well-meaning and have nurtured myself and others, would bring these celebrities, if you will, in and tell these horrible stories, and then you'd have 100 kids walk out thinking, well, golly, I've never done drugs, I've never slept around, I've never, et cetera, maybe I should so I can find Jesus. And in youth ministry, we discovered that really had done more damage than help.
Yeah.
And so we, as practical theologians, have entered into that discourse and talked about not just the dramatic conversion, which is important, and worthwhile, but also this nurtured conversion for young people who all of their lives have known that in their own faith tradition, Jesus Christ was their Lord and Savior, etc. That kind of language that we have brought to the discourse has really been very, very helpful. I think you're raising a really, really fine point, as Matt, you did earlier, about we have some language that we can offer to this, and we cannot let religious experience just be reduced to these mystical experiences. There are persons who on an everyday basis find God, whatever, in ways of usual interaction, even in a Presbyterian campus. So it's entirely possible to do that, so thank you.
Janine Leonard, I am the chaplain at an adolescent chemical dependency treatment program. And so I work with those kids that really don't want to find Jesus because they've really enjoyed the highs that they get. And it's actually their pain that brings them to the point of realizing that I need transformation. The thing that I wanted to raise, though, is, and David, you touched on this, the importance, there is genetic differences that we're showing with the brain, and yet the young men in particular that I work with would not necessarily fit some of the research. They are the men that are very, when we kind of strip away the addiction itself, what we find are these young men that are very intuitive, very sensitive, very big-hearted, that have taken in so much and not known what to do with it, have been told that emotions aren't okay to be expressed. So I agree with your caution, because I think just like, back in the 70s and 80s when we were starting to look at the similarities with boys and girls, and that they all came into the world the same being, and it was all culture that changed them. I think we need to keep in mind that genetically they do come in the world differently, and there might be predispositions one way or the other. I know one of the research pieces that I have heard is that if a mother has the more sons she has, the lower the testosterone level in the son is, because of the youngest one, because of the hormones that are balanced in the uterus at the time. And it has to do, sometimes they're showing, with young men that become gay. So I don't think we can say, I'm fascinated with the difference, and I'm also very cautious about it.
Well said. Any comments?
No, but thank you.
Okay.
Well said.
I'm sorry to ask one more question, but I really I have to ask this because it's been on my mind a lot, and it relates to diversity. Getting back to the panel's topic, and it concerns not race or gender, but age in our practices, and the issue of diversity of age in our practices. And I'm thinking primarily as in congregations. I work in a school, so I'm very aware of how we tend to put the age groups right into specific sorts of holding patterns, pens, if you will, and that they stay there, and that they're separated from the other ages and so on and so forth. And so I've been thinking about this a lot with the work that Dory and Joyce Mercer have been doing about intergenerational work. And so what I'm curious about is when I have told people sometimes during the conference here over the last couple of days that some of the stuff that we're doing with very, very young kids and sort of attention to the relational necessity of affirmation and so on and so forth of the child, and I say I'm doing that in a different way, but really the same sort of thing with my 17 and 18-year-olds, and they seem very surprised. And so what I'm interested in is what do you think are some of the dangers of our sort of too quick or easy appropriation of what this brain science is telling us about developmental processes, and how we can actually maybe do some more harm than good in some of our congregational practices by focusing too narrowly on some of these developmental issues, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. I mean, my concern has been, as a beginning teacher, and apologies to Kieran, who was my formative mentor in seminary, in religious education, I sort of became a developmentalist. I'm sorry, I admit it, I confess it, but, and I was really good at dividing people up and this and that, and for education, I thought I was doing the most scientific, best practice you could imagine. But over time, I myself have realized I like the mixing, and I like being an iconoclast. I like being different. I stand out in that regard. But I have found the richness in these new intergenerational groupings, such as Joyce talks about, and Dory, and even some of Evelyn's work. I'm intrigued by what happens when you get different people together, whether it's age issues or diversity in terms of faith traditions or whatever. I think the richness that comes out in the educational experience far outweighs any scientific concern or effort to be prescriptive. So the theory says this, so we're determined we must divide it like this, we must follow this. I don't want to do that anymore. I don't do that anymore. It's always, I'm looking for balance. Where do people learn? How do I create an environment in which learning takes place? That's my motto, my mantra. And if it means at that given time it's good for teen girls to be together at this time to talk about this topic, so be it. But if creating an environment for learning to take place means that I need to mix it either age-wise or diversity-wise or whatever, then I have to do that. Because I want learning to take place. I want people to experience something, find some meaning out of that moment together. And so I'm not tied down anymore to descriptions and using these as prescriptions of what I must do. So I look for that balance, and that becomes my issue.
Thank you, Kathy. We're just about out of time, so I wonder if we could have just one more question or comment and then response, and then it'll be time to wrap up.
My research focuses on children's spiritual formation in intercultural contexts. And the whole idea of pruning has become very interesting to me, especially, Roger, in light of what you were saying about differences in physicality of brains among cultures. So my question is, are brains born different, or are they made different? Do they become different? And if it's the latter, how does that happen? And what does it mean for children's religious education?
Okay, time's up. Time's up. I think the answer to your question is yes. It's both. It's both.
Thank you, Dave. Yes, and David holds on it, that Nesbitt is arguing that because of this long trajectory, for instance, of Western brains versus Asian brains, so it starts in genetics, that these brains are born differently, but then the environment continues to nurture and reinforce it. So yes. Well, yeah, indeed, or not. So part of the fascinating conversation, I was talking to Nesbitt about this, I was emailing him, University of Michigan, and he's talking about looking at the Canadian, Korean, American emphasis of the 1.5 generation. So they're born in Korea, they've got an Asian brain, but they come over at 5 or 6 years old, and they're growing up in Canada, of all places, and trying to figure out what it means to be Canadian. And Nesbitt talks about how he sees Korean Canadians, Korean Americans who seem to say, 1.5 generation, that they are Canadians who happen to be Korean. Whereas their parents say, I'm Korean, who happens to be living in Canada.
Roger, it could be worse. They could be grown up in Seattle.
And you already see in your research, Dr. Cisneros, that it's both and, but it's fascinating stuff to see. And it pushes the boundaries of exactly where Kathy took us in terms of perspective versus descriptive. It's really quite fascinating.
Let's just, in light of the dual focal points of the conference, or of this session, I invite you to take 2 questions away. Where will you carry this conversation from here about neuroscience and religious education? And secondly, I invite you to think about how this conference will help you understand the diversity of religious experiences and religious faiths that we find in the world today. And then lastly, I invite you to think about what are the next steps for you in addressing both of those other 2 questions. Thank you.